The city was already on edge when Trump's motorcade arrived. Protests had been building for weeks. Two rival demonstrations, one supporting Victor, one opposing him, had converged in the city center. Police struggled to maintain separation between the groups. Tensions simmered at dangerous levels. Local officials had privately urged Victor to cancel the event, citing security concerns and the risk of violence. Trump refused. He never backed down from confrontation. In fact, he seemed to thrive on it. The speech was scheduled for 7 p.m. in the city's main plaza. 22 minutes of remarks that Trump's team had carefully prepared. Every word vetted by advisors. Every phrase tested with focus groups. Every pause strategically placed. This was supposed to be Trump's moment to unite his supporters, project strength, and dominate the news cycle. But one unscripted moment would change everything. Now, we're about to explore the speech that ignited streets, divided a nation, and revealed the true power and danger of political rhetoric in a polarized society. The setting. Understanding what happened requires understanding the moment. The nation was fractured. Economic anxiety gripped working families. Cultural conflicts dominated every conversation. Trust in institutions had collapsed. Media outlets broadcast completely contradictory versions of reality. And Trump sat at the center of this division, celebrated by millions, despised by millions more. The city where Trump chose to speak was itself divided. Wealthy districts supported him overwhelmingly. Working-class neighborhoods were split. Progressive areas viewed him with intense hostility. The choice of location wasn't accidental. Trump deliberately picked contested territory, a place where his presence would generate maximum attention and controversy. Security preparations were extraordinary. Federal agents, local police, and Trump's private security team established multiple perimeters around the plaza. Counter-sniper teams positioned on surrounding rooftops. Metal detectors screened every attendee. Helicopters circled overhead. The atmosphere felt less like a political rally and more like a military operation. Inside the security perimeter, 15,000 supporters gathered. They'd waited for hours in the heat, waving flags and chanting slogans. The energy was electric, almost desperate. These weren't casual attendees. They were true believers who saw Trump as their champion against forces they believed threatened their way of life. Outside the perimeter, 8,000 protesters gathered. They carried signs denouncing Trump as a threat to democracy. They chanted counter slogans. They live-streamed their demonstration. They were equally passionate, equally convinced that history would judge their opposition as righteous resistance. Between these two crowds stood lines of police in riot gear, maintaining a fragile peace that everyone knew could shatter at any moment. The prepared remarks. Trump took the stage at 7:04 p.m., 4 minutes behind schedule. The crowd erupted. Cheers, applause, chants of his name. The sound was deafening. Trump stood at the podium, soaking in the adulation. He understood better than anyone how to work a crowd, how to build energy, how to create a connection that felt personal even in front of thousands. The teleprompter displayed his prepared speech. 22 minutes of carefully crafted rhetoric designed to energize his base while providing just enough moderation to avoid inflaming tensions further. He began with familiar themes: the economy, border security, law and order. He attacked his opponents, but with language his team had deliberately softened. He made promises about the future. He told stories about everyday Americans who supported his agenda. The speech was classic Trump, combative but controlled, aggressive but strategic. For 19 minutes, everything went according to plan. The crowd responded on cue. The message stayed on track. Even the protesters outside remained relatively calm, their chants barely audible inside the plaza. Then, in minute 20, something happened. The unscripted moment. A protester somehow breached security. No one ever fully explained how. Perhaps a credential was stolen or forged. Perhaps someone on the security team was sympathetic. Perhaps it was simple luck and timing. But suddenly, a young woman was running toward the stage, screaming denunciations at Victor. Security personnel reacted instantly, tackling her before she got within 20 feet of the podium. The crowd gasped. Victor stepped back from the microphone. For 3 seconds, chaos dominated the scene. Then Victor did something his advisors would later describe as catastrophic. Instead of continuing his prepared remarks or waiting for security to restore order, Victor went off script. He pointed at the protester being dragged away and said, "You see this? This is what we're dealing with. These people can't win at the ballot box, so they resort to intimidation and violence. But I have a message for them: we will not be intimidated. We will not back down. And when we're done, they'll wish they'd never started this fight. The crowd roared approval, but the words, "They'll wish they'd never started this fight," would echo far beyond the plaza. Victor continued, his prepared speech abandoned entirely. The teleprompter still scrolled with his vetted remarks, but he ignored it. He spoke from instinct now, feeding off the crowd's energy and his own anger at the disruption. They want to silence us. They want to intimidate us. They want to make us afraid to speak our minds, to defend our values, to fight for our country. But I'm here to tell you, we're not afraid. We're stronger than they are. We're more determined, and we're going to show them exactly what happens when they push too far. Each sentence ratcheted up the tension. Each declaration drew louder cheers from his supporters and angrier chants from protesters outside who could hear his words through loudspeakers. Victor's chief of staff, watching from backstage, later described the moment. "I saw him cross a line." The prepared speech was carefully calibrated to be strong but not inflammatory. What he said instead was red meat to the base and gasoline on a fire to everyone else. "I knew immediately we were going to have a problem. The escalation." Victor spoke for 3 more minutes in this unscripted mode. His language became increasingly confrontational, his gestures more aggressive, his tone more combative. He questioned the motivations of his opponents. He suggested they weren't just wrong but actively malicious. He painted a picture of an existential struggle where compromise wasn't possible and victory was the only option. He used language that his supporters heard as strength but his opponents heard as threats. Then he delivered the line that would define the entire event: "They think they can stop us. They think they can break our movement. But I promise you this: when this is over, when we've won, they're going to understand that in this country, we don't surrender to mobs. We fight back." The crowd went absolutely wild, chanting, cheering, celebrating what they heard as defiant courage. But outside the security perimeter, protesters heard something very different: an implied threat, a promise of retribution, a declaration that their dissent would be punished. What happened next would be debated for years. Who struck first? Did protesters try to breach the barriers, or did police move preemptively? Did Victor's security team overreact, or did they respond appropriately to a genuine threat? The video evidence was inconclusive, showing different angles that supported different narratives. But within minutes of Victor's speech ending, violence erupted. The street battle. The clashes lasted for 3 hours. Protesters attempted to push through police lines. Officers deployed tear gas and pepper spray. Victor's supporters, energized by his rhetoric, confronted counter-protesters. Bottles flew. Punches were thrown. The carefully maintained separation between the two groups collapsed into chaos. By the time order was restored, 47 people had been injured. 12 were arrested. Property damage exceeded $2 million. And the images of the violence, burning trash cans, bloodied faces, police in riot gear, dominated every news outlet in the nation. Victor had left the plaza immediately after his speech, his motorcade rushing him to the airport before the worst violence erupted. But his words hung over the scene like a toxic cloud, with both sides claiming his rhetoric had directly incited the conflict. The media firestorm. By the next morning, the speech and its aftermath were the only story that mattered. Opposition media played the most inflammatory clips on repeat. They brought in experts to analyze Victor's language, pointing out how specific phrases could be interpreted as calls to action. They interviewed injured protesters who blamed Victor directly for the violence. They demanded accountability, resignation, even criminal charges for incitement. Pro-Victor media told a completely different story. They emphasized the protester who breached security, framing Victor's response as justified and even restrained. They showed video of protesters initiating violence. They argued Victor was being blamed for defending himself and his supporters against genuinely dangerous opposition. They portrayed him as a victim of a coordinated attack by his enemies. And the truth? It existed somewhere in the complicated middle, a place where nuance and context matter but rarely survive in modern political discourse. Victor's non-apology. Victor addressed the controversy 36 hours later with a statement that satisfied no one but his core supporters. "I went to that city to speak to the American people about important issues facing our nation," he said. "My supporters gathered peacefully to hear that message. But extremist protesters tried to disrupt our event with violence and intimidation. I will never apologize for defending my supporters or speaking hard truths that my opponents don't want to hear. He acknowledged the injuries but blamed them entirely on radical protesters who brought violence to what should have been a peaceful event. He defended his unscripted remarks as speaking from the heart about the threats we face as a nation. He showed no remorse, no reflection, no acknowledgement that his words might have contributed to the escalation. His statement divided opinion exactly as his speech had. Supporters praised his refusal to back down. Opponents condemned his failure to take any responsibility for inflaming tensions. The political polarization deepened. The lasting impact. After that night, the unspoken boundaries around inflammatory language seemed to dissolve. Other politicians on both sides adopted increasingly aggressive rhetoric. Political events required massive security operations. Violence at demonstrations became more common, not less. Victor Hale's approval ratings followed their now familiar pattern. Sharp drops among independents and opponents, increased enthusiasm among his base, overall stability that suggested the nation was locked into fixed positions regardless of events. But something more profound had changed. The speech demonstrated how quickly political rhetoric could translate into physical violence. It showed how a single unscripted moment could overwhelm weeks of careful planning. And it revealed the terrifying power of a charismatic leader to channel collective anger into potentially dangerous action. The unanswered questions. Years later, analysts and historians still debate what really happened that night. Did Victor deliberately abandon his prepared remarks to inflame his supporters, or did he simply react emotionally to an unexpected disruption? Were his words a calculated strategy to energize his base through confrontation, or an uncontrolled response that exceeded his intentions? Did his rhetoric directly cause the violence, or was the conflict inevitable given the broader tensions in society? Would the same violence have occurred with different words, or did his specific language push angry crowds past a critical threshold? And most troubling, did Victor understand in that moment the potential consequences of his words, or was he so focused on dominating the immediate situation that he couldn't see how his rhetoric would echo beyond the plaza? The speech that divided a nation lasted 22 minutes. But its effects rippled through the political landscape for years. It demonstrated the power of political theater at its most dangerous, when emotion overwhelms strategy, when rhetoric becomes action, and when leaders discover they can unleash forces they may not be able to control. Victor Hale spoke that night in a divided city, and when he finished, the divisions had deepened into chasms. Whether that was his intention or an unintended consequence remains unclear. But the result was undeniable. In 22 minutes, he demonstrated that in modern politics, words aren't just words. They're weapons, and their casualties are measured in injuries, arrests, and a society increasingly unable to bridge the gaps between its warring factions.